Uh, we have Jonas Stähelin. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. You will be speaking on religious conversion as energy conversion, William James thermodynamics, and the occult. Jonas is a PhD student at the Chair for Literature and Cultural Studies, ETH Zurich, Switzerland, supervised by Professor Dr. Andreas Kilcher. His doctoral research is part of the project entitled The Scientification and Aestheticization of, within quotes, esotericism in the long 19th century. It is funded by Swiss National Science Foundation. Jonas's academic background is in the history and philosophy of science. The floor is yours.
Hello, do you guys hear me? Okay, because my internet has been a bit shaky. I'm in this mining town in Colorado, stranded because there was a huge mudslide, so we couldn't get to the place where we're supposed to get. So yeah, I hope it works. So thanks also Misha and Faith for organizing this. I would have liked to be here physically with you, but I had to attend a wedding, and with COVID and shifting dates, this kind of overlapped. So I'm doing it from here. So yeah, religious conversion as energy conversion, William James, energy physics, and the occult. The American psychologist and philosopher William James, who is perhaps best known for his philosophy of pragmatism, was also drawn to the occult, as his lifelong involvement in psychic research conveys. Yet he was equally magnified by the wonders of science, and both interests, I argue in this paper, happily commingled in his religious philosophy. So in what follows, I want to trace how the language of energy physics and elements of the occult are mutually productive in William James' theory of religious conversion. In 1875, let's see how I can switch the slide. Okay, here. In 1875, the publication of a book called The Unseen Universe, or Physical Speculations on a Future State, caused quite a stir. First published anonymously, it was actually written by two eminent Scottish physicists, Peter Guthrie Tait and Balfour Stewart. Employing contemporary physical theories about thermodynamics, the ether, and the atom, they argued that life after death was possible, quote, strictly in accordance, end quote, with the laws of nature. According to the authors, an unseen universe existed alongside the visible one, and between the two, a series of energy transformations was supposed to exist. Upon death, the authors then stipulated life was simply transferred energetically from the visible to the invisible universe. Now, as several historians have noticed, the unseen universe quickly gained popular success as a critical response to John Tyndall's infamous Belfast Address of 1874. Along with Darwin's bulldog, the biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, John Tyndall was part of a newly emerging professional class of scientists which sought to wrestle the pursuit of truth from the shackles of theological dogmas. Now, both Huxley and Tyndall considered the natural world, as it appeared to the senses through controlled experiments, the principal object of knowledge. Through his address, which was heavily debated in public, Tyndall emerged as one of the major voices in scientific naturalism and the reductive materialism it entailed. It was against the restrictions of such a worldview that Tait and Balfour aimed their critique. In May of the same year, William James reviewed The Unseen Universe for the Nation, praising the author's, quote, freshness and originality, end quote, in combining elements of religious belief with what James considered the, quote, most ruthless of modern scientific hypotheses, end quote. Refreshing it must have felt indeed in a period when science and the exigencies of religion seemed to increasingly diverge. But what did those most ruthless modern scientific hypotheses, which Balfour and Tait had managed to so miraculously combine with biblical texts, actually refer to? So let us turn back to Tyndall's Belfast Address in search for some clues. So apart from the assumption that matter constituted the ultimate level of reality, Tyndall had famously argued for the principle of the continuity of nature. that is, nature up to its minutest details, from the inorganic to the organic, from matter to mind, was governed by the same causal laws. And this principle, also known as the principle of the uniformity of nature, received much strength from the doctrine of the conservation of energy. And according to Tyndall, it was this doctrine that bound, quote, nature, fast and fate, bringing vital as well as physical phenomena under the dominion of that law of causal connection, which, so far as the human understanding has yet pierced, asserts itself everywhere in nature. So, although such an understanding of nature as governed by universal causal laws did not make the belief in God an outright impossibility, to my knowledge, Tyndall was not an atheist. It did argue for a strict separation of the natural from the supernatural, for any influence of the latter onto the former was considered a violation of the law of the conservation of energy, and thus a break with the principle of the uniformity of nature. So to James, it must have been all the more reassuring that not all Victorian scientists took such hypotheses to the same ruthless conclusions. So back to the Unseen Universe. As the authors of the Unseen Universe noted in the preface to the first edition, their critique was directed at the, quote, materialistic statements nowadays freely made, end quote. And towards one such professed statement, they evinced particular concern, namely that the belief in immortality was incompatible with the just mentioned principle of continuity. Tate and Balfour, however, were convinced of the contrary, if only this principle be, quote, rightly viewed, end quote. So while they acknowledged that the law of the conservation of energy bundled the cosmos into a unified and causally connected system, they also included what they called the unseen universe within this equation. And life after death, their major cause of concern, was no miracle which broke with the continuity of natural law. Rather, upon death, they argued that the energy of life was not merely lost, but simply transferred by way of ethereal undulations from the visible to the invisible universe, whereupon it enjoyed a timeless existence. And while the visible universe decayed, the invisible universe promised a sort of infinite storehouse of energy. So the principle of continuity and the law of the conservation of energy remained safely intact, since the visible and the invisible universe were seen to form a closed energetic system. Now, in his review, James contended that, quote, the upshot of all these speculations is that matter and the medium, or the visible and the invisible, are considered materially and dynamically continuous, end quote. In particular, James seems to have found the idea of an ethereal world with all its stored up energy, that's a term James uses, appealing. For although the invisible world was timeless to the extent that it never ceased to exist, it nonetheless had a, quote, history with that of the visible world, since by transfer of energy from the latter, it is conditioned by the particulars which are now and here occurring. Every event here, then, is recorded by its traces on the invisible world, and these traces may be organized, it is not attempted to define how, into a memory. So from the idea of an ethereal world as an infinite storehouse of energy, we are thus led to the idea, speculative all the more so, of the ethereal world as retaining memories of all events past and present. So to James, this offered the possibility for a continuity of being. And that is, in Jameson's parlance, was just another way, perhaps a bit modest, to referring to the question of immortality, and is the continuity of being after death. And he famously tackled this question in a pair of Harvard lectures on the same subject that he delivered more than a decade later in 1898, and to which we shall now turn. So in a manner more explicit than Tate and Balfour, James associated the invisible universe with consciousness on a cosmic scale, a consciousness which was capable of organizing all events of the visible world into a memory. And it was interesting to see Sam's talk, and I think there's some overlap, because obviously this idea of a cosmic consciousness was very important to James. And we'll get back to that later. So James had already developed a similar notion of what he called a cosmic reservoir with which our individual consciousness was connected to in 1890. And he did this in a text called A Record of Observations of Certain Phenomena of Trance, which was a text about sittings he did with the famous medium Leonora Piper. And in his lectures on human immortality, he argued that our individual consciousness was continuous with what he called a mother sea of consciousness. And another notion he developed in these lectures further underlined the continuity between this mother sea and individual consciousness. And it was what he called the transmissive function of the brain. Now, according to James, the brain did not produce consciousness, but rather it transmitted it. In other words, the brain supposedly functioned like a lens. He uses this analogy, which focuses the, quote, energy of light to a certain path of shape. So similarly, James argued that consciousness may well exist independently of the brain as a kind of stuff. He often talks about like mind stuff kind of floating around in this larger mother sea of consciousness. And the function of the brain was to bundle this mind stuff into a unified consciousness. So not unlike the unseen universe, James' theory of the transmissive function of the brain highlighted mediation between the visible universe, in this case, the world of individual consciousness, and then the invisible universe, which in James's case is associated with this mother sea of consciousness. Now, that James thought of this relation in energetic terms as a sort of transmission of energy becomes evident when we take a closer look at his theory of religious conversion, which he already elaborates on in his lectures on human immortality. Now, James had already argued in favor of a transmissive theory of consciousness because it could explain a variety of phenomena that a productive theory of consciousness could not. And among such phenomena, he counted principally religious conversions, but also premonitions, apparitions, clairvoyant visions, so all these kind of more psychic or occult phenomena. Now, as he notes in his lecture on human immortality, quote, in cases of conversion, it seems to the subject themselves of the experience as if a power from without, quite different from the ordinary action of the senses or of the sense-led mind, came into their life, as if the latter suddenly opened into that greater life in which it has its source. Now, under the productive theory of the brain, that is basically the theory that the brain produces consciousness, such an experience would be entirely meaningless, since no account could be made of the mysterious power sweeping over the individual consciousness during a conversion experience. Now, to James, such experiences like religious conversion should instead lead us suppose, quote, the continuity of our consciousness with a mother sea, end quote, from which bursts, and now this is another term he frequently uses, spiritual energy pours over. So spiritual energy pours over from the mother sea into individual consciousness. So let us now turn to the Varieties, the last text I'll take a look at. Probably his most famous text or series of lectures that was then published as a book. And it is here that he gives a more fully fledged theory of religious conversion. So in the Varieties, this metaphor of the mother sea obviously takes on a stronger religious bent, becoming almost synonymous with the divine. And if we consider his well-known definition of religion that you probably know, since there's a lot of historians of religion here, I don't want to go into the details of it. I just want to mention that in this second sentence, which is often left out, there is this, he says that the relation between the individual and the divine can also be physical. And in the concluding lectures, you see the quote in the bottom, James again stresses that communion with the divine was a, quote, process wherein work is really done and which produced material effects within the phenomenal world. And again, work is another physical concept drawn from 19th century physics. And in what follows, I want to point out that James now really circumscribes religious conversion somewhat literally as a conversion of energy. And in fact, James's frequent use of terms borrowed from physics, such as energy, force, field, or work, is quite striking. And this has also been noted by scholars, as Stephanie Hawkins has noted in an excellent paper. James' interest in these physical concepts can be traced back to his earliest diaries and reading notebooks. And James was especially influenced by German strands of scientific naturalism, particularly Gustav Theodor Fechner's psychophysics. And now to James, these physical concepts stood at the intersection between mind and matter, and he gave them a psychological dimension. And James actually spent some time in Germany, where he was heavily influenced by German naturalists and philosophers such as Fechner, but also Helmholtz would be another person to be counted. He had already developed an understanding of consciousness, let's go back to that, functioning like an electromagnetic field with an energetic center and a surrounding periphery in his principles of psychology. And out of the varieties, he made even more explicit use of such physical terminology. Now, in its totality, he saw consciousness as structured like an electromagnetic field. And as we went from the center to the periphery, we gradually moved from the conscious to the unconscious subliminal self, which a term you might know he borrowed from Frederick Myers. Now, during the act of conversion, spiritual energy flowed in through this subliminal door and spilled over into consciousness, eventually shifting the, quote, habitual center of energy. And in this sense, accursion was akin to an explosion. He talks of the explosiveness of religious conversion. So energy is accumulated at the edges of consciousness until it erupts into the center, and then leading to a kind of restructuring of the field. So that's basically it. Just to conclude, so we've seen energy, transmission, conversion, field, work. These terms are very close to the conceptual register of 19th century physics. And this is worth mentioning because a lot of the secondary literature on James has kind of stressed that James was really critical of science, especially kind of naturalist science, and that his kind of life goal was always, or his work was always in kind of there was a tension between James as a religious thinker, as a philosopher, and James as a scientist, as an empirical scientist. But what I've tried to show is that this is actually not as such a tension, but rather a series of mutual entanglements and productive engagements. Because evidently the register of physics offered a powerful way to imagine how the individual stood in relation to a kind of higher spiritual order. And similar to the unseen universe, James conceived this as a series of conversions, transfers, or transmissions of energies. And to James, arguing for such a continuity between these worlds was obviously of very high moral significance, because during the act of conversion, this spiritual energy was converted into concrete acts in the phenomenal world, because the subject undergoing such a conversion then leads a different life, and in a material sense leads a different life. So yeah, that's it.